Star Wars Outlaws did not fail because there was nothing here. It failed because the best version of the game was buried under the wrong expectations. That sounds like a defense. It is not. Outlaws has problems, real ones. There are missions that feel over-controlled, stealth sections that feel like they are afraid of player freedom, and open-world habits that make the galaxy feel smaller than it should. But the mistake is treating those flaws as the whole story. Because underneath the formula, there is a much more interesting Star Wars game trying to get out. Not a Jedi game, not a rebellion game, not a clean hero fantasy where the galaxy bends around you because you are important. Outlaws is at its best when it does the opposite. It makes Vess small. It puts her at tables she does not control in rooms owned by people worse than her inside a galaxy where every favor becomes debt. And that is the case worth reopening. Not, was Star Wars Outlaws secretly perfect? It was not. The better question is this: did everyone review the wrong game? The public verdict became simple very quickly. Ubisoft formula, no Jedi. Another open world, too much stealth, too much checklist design, not enough freedom, not enough surprise. And to be clear, a lot of that criticism was fair. This is not the kind of video that pretends the bad parts are actually genius if you stare at them long enough. Some parts are just bad. Some parts are familiar in the worst possible way. Some missions feel like they were built by a committee that trusted the setting more than the systems. But the discourse around Outlaws flattened the game into one sentence. Ubisoft made a Star Wars open world and it was not the one people wanted. That sentence is useful, but it is incomplete. Because if you only look for the Ubisoft open world, you mostly find the Ubisoft open world. You find the map, the guards, the camps, the routes, the stealth rules, the upgrades, the familiar loop. But if you look at the scenes that actually stick, the game starts pointing somewhere else, not toward freedom, toward pressure, not toward power, toward survival, not toward a player fantasy where you own the galaxy, toward a criminal fantasy where the galaxy already belongs to other people, and you are just trying to move through it without getting crushed. That is the version of Outlaws that deserved a better conversation. Open world Star Wars is a dangerous promise. Those 3 words carry more expectation than almost any feature list can survive. People hear open world and imagine freedom. They hear Star Wars and imagine scale, planets, ships, cantinas, blasters, reputation, maybe no force powers, maybe no lightsaber, but still the feeling that you are finally being let loose in the galaxy. Even when the marketing says scoundrel, a lot of players still expect importance. They expect the world to open up because they arrived. They expect the game to understand that Star Wars is supposed to feel big, and Outlaws does try to sell that. It gives you planets, it gives you a ship, it gives you syndicates, speeders, space combat, restricted zones, and the promise of a criminal life. But the strongest moments in Outlaws are not the ones where the world feels huge. They are the moments where the world feels owned. That difference matters. A huge world says, go anywhere. An owned world says, who gave you permission? And Outlaws is much sharper when it asks the second question. That is why the power fantasy expectation misses the game's best angle. Vess is not interesting because she is finally a player-shaped hero in Star Wars. She is interesting because she is constantly negotiating the fact that she is not. Vess is not powerful. That is not automatically a flaw. That is the point the game keeps trying to make. She is not a chosen one. She is not a Jedi in disguise. She is not a legendary smuggler at the start of her myth. She is broke. She is cornered. She needs tools she cannot afford, favors she should not accept, and Nix beside her because half the time he is the difference between a plan and a disaster. That is why Kay and Nix work better than people give them credit for. Nix is not just a cute companion for clips. He makes Kay's vulnerability visible. When Nix helps her, the scene is not saying, look at this powerful outlaw with a gadget. It is saying, this person survives because she cannot do it alone. That is a very different Star Wars fantasy. Most Star Wars games make you feel like the galaxy is waiting for your importance to be revealed. Outlaws is better when it makes you feel like the galaxy does not care if you survive. A locked door is not just a puzzle. A guard is not just an enemy. a contact is not just a quest giver. Every object, every room, every person becomes leverage, and once you see the game that way, Kay's weakness stops feeling like a missing power fantasy and starts feeling like the actual design premise. The problem is that the game does not trust that premise consistently enough, but when it does, it has teeth. The reputation system is easy to describe like a feature. Do a job for one syndicate, lose standing with another, get access here, create heat there, make one room safer and another room more dangerous. On paper, that sounds like a normal open-world faction system, but the better read is that reputation is the game's real villain. Not because the mechanic is perfect, it is not, but because it understands something Star Wars games rarely sit with for long. In the criminal galaxy, nothing is clean. Every shortcut becomes debt. Every favor creates a witness. Every alliance makes someone else a problem. That is why the syndicate material matters. The Pikes, Crimson Dawn, the Hutts, Ashiga, Zarek Besh, they are not just names for lore fans to recognize, they are the pressure system that makes Kay's story work. The game is telling you that survival here is not heroic, it is transactional. You are not choosing between good and evil most of the time. You are choosing who gets angry now, who gets useful later, and how long you can keep pretending those are separate decisions. That is a better Star Wars premise than the discourse gave it credit for, because it pulls the franchise away from destiny and into consequence. It says the galaxy is not only shaped by empires and rebels, it is also shaped by ledgers, favors, debts, and rooms where the person smiling at you already knows what you owe. That is the Star Wars Outlaws I wish the whole game had trusted. Jabba works because the game does not need to explain him. His name changes the temperature of the scene. That is the difference between nostalgia and pressure. Bad nostalgia pauses the story so the audience can recognize a thing. Good recognition changes what the scene means. When Jabba enters the orbit of outlaws, the mission does not just become more familiar, it becomes more dangerous. You understand the power structure before the game explains it. You understand that Kay has not walked into another objective. She has walked into a hierarchy. That is exactly how Legacy Star Wars should be used in a game like this. Not as a museum, not as a checklist of references, not as a parade of familiar names, as leverage. Jabba is not interesting here because he is recognizable. He is interesting because recognition does work. It makes the player understand how small Kay is without a tutorial, a codex entry, or a speech. The room already has history. The danger already has a shape. The audience already knows that this is not a place where Kay can simply act clever and leave clean. That is why the Tatooine material is one of the strongest long-form anchors in the archive. It gives the video a recognizable Star Wars hook, but it also supports the deeper argument. Outlaws is best when the familiar galaxy becomes a pressure system, not a theme park. When Outlaws works, it feels like street-level Star Wars, not mythic, not chosen, not clean. It is a galaxy of back rooms, favors, compromised jobs, restricted doors, dangerous names, and people who smile because they already know you owe them. That version of Star Wars has teeth, and it gives Kay and Nix a reason to matter, not because they can overpower the galaxy, because they are trying to slip through it. The action works better when it has that context. A shootout is more interesting when it feels like the cost of a bad deal. A stealth section is more interesting when it feels like trespassing inside someone else's economy. A space battle is more interesting when it feels like every smaller decision finally catching up. This is where Outlaws finds a real identity. It is not the first game to have factions. It is not the first game to have stealth. It is not the first game to make a player run errands for criminals. But inside Star Wars, those pieces create a very specific fantasy. What if the galaxy far, far away is not waiting for you to become important? What if you are just one more person trying to survive the machinery beneath the myth? That is a strong idea, strong enough to make the game's weaker parts more frustrating, because you can see the better version right there. And then the game betrays itself. Too often, Outlaws stops being a crime story and becomes a checklist with guards. The stealth gets too rigid. The routes get too familiar. The danger turns into pattern, the pressure turns into objective design. That is where the criticism lands, not because stealth is automatically bad, not because Star Wars cannot support slower, more constrained gameplay, but because the best stealth in a game like this should feel like social pressure made physical. You are not just hiding from guards, you are trespassing inside someone else's power. When the game remembers that, the restricted zones work. When it forgets, they become another room full of cones of vision, alarms, and route timing. The same thing happens with combat. When the fight is tied to a faction, a debt, a rescue, or a consequence, it has weight. When it becomes another escape sequence from another base, the sharper fantasy starts to disappear. This is not a small problem. This is the central tension of Outlaws. The game keeps discovering a better identity, then sanding it down into something safer and flatter. That is why a fair critique cannot just say, the game is underrated. It has to say something more uncomfortable. Outlaws had a strong idea and then kept interrupting it with weaker design habits. So no, the criticism was not simply wrong. The frame was too small. If you review Outlaws only as a Ubisoft open world, you find the Ubisoft open world. If you review it only as a missing Jedi fantasy, you find the absence of the Jedi fantasy. If you review it only as a Star Wars product arriving at a tired moment for the brand, you find the fatigue before you find the game. But if you look at what the strongest scenes are actually doing, a different game appears. A game about being powerless inside a famous galaxy. A game about debt instead of destiny. A game about the people underneath the myth. That does not erase the flaws, it makes them more precise. The issue is not that Outlaws failed to make Kay into a legend. The issue is that it did not always understand how strong it was when she was not one. That is the review frame the game needed, not, is this the ultimate open-world Star Wars game? Not, is this the next great Ubisoft map? Not, does this let me live out every fantasy I have ever had about the galaxy? The better question is, does this game make survival inside the Star Wars underworld feel dangerous, costly, and specific? Sometimes yes, and when it does, it becomes much more interesting than its reputation. Star Wars Outlaws is not the Star Wars game everyone wanted. It is uneven, it is constrained. It sometimes turns its best ideas into familiar mission design, but buried inside it is a question the discourse did not take seriously enough. What does Star Wars look like when nobody is coming to save you? No Force, no prophecy, no chosen bloodline, no clean rebellion myth arriving to make the moral shape obvious, just Kay, Nix, a stolen ship, too many debts, and a galaxy where survival is never free. That is the version of Outlaws worth talking about, not because it proves everyone was wrong, because it proves the conversation was incomplete. The game did not need to be defended as a masterpiece. It needed to be understood as a messy attempt at a different fantasy. And honestly, that is what makes it more interesting than a simple failure. It is not just a bad open world, it is not just an underrated Star Wars game, it is a game split between two identities. One familiar, safe, and overbuilt, the other sharper, dirtier, and much closer to the scoundrel story Star Wars almost never lets us stay inside. Outlaws is at its best when it chooses the second one, and that is the case I would reopen.